Thank you for being here. You know, today is the final school district to go back. DPS goes a little later and starts a little later. So this is exciting. It's kind of means everyone's back in gear. I've been asking superintendents, what is the overriding theme this year as we sort of move beyond the last 2 years of COVID and how that clouded the beginning of every school year? Is the feeling different this year?
Very different. Thank you for that question. I've said it to my board, I've said it to the public, I've said it to my leaders, to my teachers, that although I loved last year, remember when we met, it was an exciting new adventure, not just for me as a first year superintendent here in DPS, but also for the community and all stakeholders. Okay, is this gonna work? And that compounded with the fact that we're rebounding from the pandemic. Last year, although it was a great exploration for me, it was the uncertainty of what the year was going to be for me and for everybody else. For parents, are we going to have an interruption this year? For board, are we going to have consistency this year? So when I compare last year to this year, it's hard to compare the two, but if I can, I'm much more excited about this year, right? Because I can guarantee some things. I can guarantee some strategy. I can guarantee some certainty in terms of what we did well last year, in which we had very limited amount of schools who had some interruptions. I'm hoping that becomes even less. Hopefully it's even zero. So it's not going back to normal, because normal was never good enough, right? But at least we can put some of those painstakes away. So the one phrase that I want to coin is every learner thrives, which is also not only the slogan, but the vision of DPS moving forward, which is going to be unveiled in the strategic roadmap, which I'm sure you all have seen by now. Excited, that's what I meant in terms of strategy. So although the first year was probably the best year of my professional career, I know that this year is going to be that much better because we have certainty, assurances, and strategy.
Let's talk a little more about that strategic plan that was the first for DPS since 2020 under a predecessor, I'm sure. The pandemic, no doubt, got in the way of things. So what does it mean to lay out a strategic plan, and how will that guide your decisions?
Well, I think it's critical, right? It tells the community, taxpayers, parents, guardians, even students, and of course our faculty where we're headed. And I want to clarify terminology. I'm big on words.
So please do, yes.
And you can tell me what I mean by that. I'll give you one example now. So although we have gone so familiar with strategic planning, one of the many lessons learned because of the pandemic is that we can't be rigid in how we set out our course of action. So it's a strategic roadmap. Now, why? And that may seem insignificant for some, but it's very important for me. So strategic thinking doesn't go away. A roadmap, there's many ways that you can get to your destination. A plan is very rigid. And what happened during the pandemic, there were a lot of plans that were crumbled up and tossed out the window. And a lot of districts across the nation and organizations came up with priority statements or priority crisis statements, if you will. So strategic plans went out the window. So we're not functioning under a plan. We're functioning in a mindset, thinking strategically, and a strategic roadmap. So if we do have to pivot, we will pivot, but we won't lose sight of our goals. So that's exciting. It may seem insignificant for some, but the terminology is so critical. And we've done a whole lot of changing names of departments, offices, and even titles here, because titles and roles and words matter. I'll give you another example if I can. We are DPS 1 for a reason. I believe that we are number 1 for a reason. With all due respect to my neighboring districts, and I wish everybody well, but we will be number 1 because we are DPS 1. Look it up. We're Region 1. And we're number 1 when it comes to the equity work that we've started and we will continue. But when I came on board, we had an equity division. So when I would ask, hey, where does this work live? They would say, over there in the equity division. So think about what that says. The equity is important. It's the cornerstone. It's one of our core values, but it lives over there. And on top of that, in a division, which means that we're not united. So that's two critical examples of how words matter for an institution that's a learning institution. From strategic thinking, strategic planning, now strategic roadmap, and of course, how we introduce and honor the work of educational equity.
Excellent. To that end, there is a new equity or a relatively new person in charge or leading some of that. Isn't that right?
Well, interesting you mentioned that. So equity is woven into our system. So we do not have a chief of equity anymore. Equity is everybody's responsibility. It's our collective responsibility. So equity is the work of everyone, from our bus driver who picks up the student in the morning to the escort and the paraprofessional who supports them on their way to during the classroom, of course the classroom, the leader, all the way to everybody who's here in this incredible building as well.
That's a really fascinating concept, is that this role belongs to everyone. Talking about planning and roadmaps to where you want to get students, by the time this interview airs, we will have seen the new CMAS data. I was able to receive a copy of it already, and we do know that students suffered learning loss during the pandemic. I believe the numbers from DPS for all students in those 3rd through 8th grade showed about 23% are not proficient in math. We know that was an area where a lot of kids were hit the hardest from the pandemic. Have you started to lay out goals, specific goals for math, literacy, and other graduation goals maybe for the students?
Of course. So we get, I guess, the fortunate, right? It depends on how you define fortunate. Fortunate because we get a glimpse before everybody else does in terms of embargo data. But we also do not know how other districts and even the nation has fared, right? So it's hard to compare. The data is out, so everybody has seen it. What I can say is that it's a shared offense what's happened to our educational system. So DPS is not immune, and also not the only district that really needs to recover. What I want from the community is that I believe in unifying the school district. I've said that since day one, and I've showed that in my actions throughout the course of last year. I want to continue to do so. And I know we're always very competitive, and I'm all for healthy competition, meaning if my school does a little bit better than yours, and terrific, we both win, but there's a 1 and there's a 2.
Yeah.
What I don't want is these sets of schools outperform these sets of schools, whether we look at region, because that doesn't help DPS as a community. And if we look at different governance types, meaning an innovation zone versus a charter versus a district run, what we can say is all our schools unfortunately need to do better if we're looking at our scores. But I have to also say that it was expected. So we're finally here in which we can say that a good amount of students have tested, because that was not the case last year.
Right.
We had less than 50%. So now that we have a true population mean, that we can say, okay, we have some actual data as baseline, because I'm considering this baseline information as we rebound from COVID, of course, and the pandemic, but also so we can set our measures. And you'll see that we have intentional measures and metrics in our roadmap to make sure that we close our gaps, but everybody begins to thrive. Hence, every learner thrives.
Excellent. Your daughter, I know, is in a bilingual school, is in a dual language program.
Yeah.
How are our bilingual learners doing, and particularly those who spoke English as a second language, perhaps Spanish speakers first?
Yeah.
How are they faring right now?
Yeah, so our multilingual learners, as expected, really suffered in terms of the most recent CMAS data. So it's not a shock, right? Those are the ones that usually receive the most support, and support was interrupted in the last X amount of years. I forget if we're going to count last year, 2 years, or 3 years, because there's been interruption to instruction. So what works is making sure that we have that ongoing support, and that was not delivered in the last 3 years. So that's why the data is not surprising. It's more of a, okay, we finally have it, here it is, a little bit of a sticker shock, but it validated what we knew, because as educators, we can predict these things. I'm using that as baseline data. When it comes to our dual language school, and there's a lot of research that my little girl and my little son, so I have a incoming first grader and ECE 4, and they're in dual language. There's always a different way of really evaluating proficiency, because in your dominant language, if it's not Spanish, then when you see the test, it's not in your dominant language. So that's usually skewed, and that's acceptable, especially in the younger grades or primary grades. Dual language research shows that once you get into grade 3, 4, 5, 6, that's when students take off in both languages. So those of us who are wondering, I know that I'm a parent as well. And if you don't see something attributed in terms of achievement, it's okay. The research shows that that's what happens when you are being taught in 2 different languages. But when it comes to our multilingual learners, which is a different a group of students and a different access of the educational model, then the interrupted instruction, just like a student who is in a pathway school, right? Every moment counts. And data shows that every moment did matter.
Yeah. We need good teachers, obviously, to keep these kids learning to achieve those goals. And I saw you were quoted just today in an article about how most teachers, not just in Denver public schools, but can't afford to live in the area where they teach. They can't afford to buy a home here, and rent has gone up. I know that you are concerned about this problem. Talking about it in that article. And at some point, we probably can't afford to pay teachers what they fully deserve and what they would need to live here in Denver and afford a home here. What are your concerns about that?
Oh, so many concerns. I'm happy that this has become something of late that we're speaking about. I think that we need to do this not only locally, regionally, statewide, and as I mentioned in that article that you referenced, it needs to happen nationally. The prestige of education, I don't know if it's where it needs to be, especially as we recover from the pandemic. I know our parents, as they wore many hats, meaning they were not only mom, dad, and guardian, they were also teacher at a certain point of the pandemic in which they had to educate their child. So I hope that there's appreciation there. But in society, I don't think it's where it needs to be. I know that when you look at other countries, a doctor, professor, a lawyer, and an educator all held to the same regard. That's not the case in the States. So as much as we have our issues in funding here in Colorado, and they're truly unique, coming from New York, I can tell you that we are not doing right by our educators as a state. And that may seem controversial, but I know I have the support from not only the educators, parents who appreciate what their child is learning, and that's as a result of what they're exposed to because of the professional that's before them. But also nationally, I feel like we can do a whole lot better. So we have the beauty of our ESSER funds, which is our COVID relief funds. I say if we can figure out a way that becomes part of the fabric on how we fund educational systems throughout the nation, then DPS will be in a better place, but also every other school district. So it's not just a DPS issue. I know I want to focus, and I'll end with focusing on DPS and what I think that we can do better. But I believe in systemic change. And I can keep scraping the pot here in DPS. And as you've seen, I have. Our bus drivers are one of the most competitive, if not the highest paid in the region. When it comes to our paraprofessionals, they are the highest paid in the region, but it's the same pot. I'm hopeful that we can do something for our teachers and for our leaders, of course. But at one point, I'm gonna run out of reserves, right? So what happens then, right? So when I wanna put my actions and, words, and put action behind those words, but I have limited resources, then I'm not fulfilling what I believe I need to do, but I also have constraints. So this is a call for help. Our call for help is for our federal government to support our states, and our states to support our local districts. Now, in terms of what we can do here, everything in our power. The beauty of negotiations is that you give some, you take some. But when it comes to compensation, it is my goal that every DPS employee at all level is either at or above market, if not very competitively compensated. I think I have a duty as the head of agency here, and I'm going to try my best throughout these years. In terms of what the impact is, when we have teachers, when we have bus drivers, paraprofessionals, psychologists, the list goes on, when you have superintendents, district staff that live in Denver, not only are you vested because of course you're a taxpayer, you're a voting citizen as well, but also you're part of the fabric of DPS, because DPS embodies the city. Now, we're the second largest employer in the entire state and city. But if our employees are not part of the system, there's something off there. So we lose institutional knowledge, legacy, and I can keep going down the road. But it's not just a teacher issue. It's not just an educator issue. it's also a parent concern as well. So if our parents can't afford it, and I've had this question asked in a press conference, hey, what are you doing to make sure that we don't have to move? And it's not just moving up to Broomfield, it's moving out of state.
Yeah.
So we're losing them altogether. And I don't have an answer for that because it's not a DPS solution. We're part of the solution, but as a City of Denver collaboration, it's a lot of our organizations that can come together. I know that we can do something, whether it's, you know, building low-income housing and perhaps even on DPS property, all controversial topics. But what I'm saying is I'm willing to come to the table to see how I can be part of the solution. Because once we lose institutional knowledge, that's a major loss for DPS.
Yeah.
And once we lose parents and the corresponding students, then now we have to downsize our footprint. And no one wants to talk about school closures, which is inevitable. And as you've seen around our community, our neighboring districts have already announced closures. Don't be surprised if we're next, because the numbers dictate what we have to do. So I beg your forgiveness, but it's something that we need to do for us to make sure that every student gets the best educational experience.
Want to talk a little bit about the school board. We have seen some reports lately, and I believe Director Tay Anderson had a letter out today calling it dysfunctional. We're seeing a lot of reporting on infighting, perhaps not. Perhaps it's adults letting their egos come out too much, or perhaps it's really a concern about the direction that they're leading the district in. I mean, what would you say to parents who are reading these articles about the school board not being on the same page when it comes to their students?
Yeah, I think that's going to change. I think today is the day that it changes, because we have data in front of us that I can say all of my honorable board members are going to be united to make sure that they articulate what needs to be articulated, but also get behind something that's going to make that narrative a better story. So they will be unified. And in terms of dysfunction, I have no comment in terms of that, but I can say that not only are they fully functional, they're incredibly brilliant in my one-on-ones. So I have incredible amount of respect for all 7 of them, because when I meet with them, not only do they push my thinking, I see their passion in every session. I want to acknowledge that perhaps when they get together, as of late, they haven't been in a common accord, but I know that's going to change, because now we have a strategic roadmap and also data that tells us, okay, we need to all get together beyond the school board, meaning all of you who are listening in need to rally behind our students, because we all need the support.
Are there competing interests between Hispanic and Black students, or white and students of color? These are things that have emerged from some of these reports from the school board in fights, and just wondering, how do you see that? How do you see those different groups of students working together and interplaying?
Well, I think that we need to work together for not only those students, but for all students. Again, the vision is every learner thrives. Something that really captivated me when I was someone exploring and potentially a candidate and ultimately the superintendent here, was what this district does and responds to that I don't think any other district in the states does, meaning I inherited a Black Excellence Resolution, never heard of that. And that's something that is notable. And also, we've been under a consent decree that addresses multilingual learners and making sure that we hit the floor. And in DPS, we're going to go above the floor in terms of our deliverable. So that right there not only is Black and brown and many shades of brown, it shows how unified this district really is. So I do not think that there is a Black and brown debate. What I think is that Black and brown support mechanism that needs to continue to happen, because I inherited one. And I think that our board members are really passionate, and I think that's what's translating. But I don't think there's a divide at all. Definitely not a versus. It's more of an and.